running this program on Facebook Live. But please feel free to drop in your questions on the chat. And at the end of the conversation between Vikram and myself, we will run through those questions, and Vikram, I'm sure, will answer all of them, or as many as is humanly possible, right, Vikram?
Yes, indeed. Even the politically incorrect ones. Maybe.
Even the politically incorrect ones, but please note that we're at the Nehru Centre. This is a diplomatic organization, so even if the questions are politically incorrect, your answers must be politically correct.
Okay, thanks for that disclaimer right at the beginning.
All right, so I'll start this event. If I may just introduce my friend Vikram. For those of you who've joined, I mean, Vikram doesn't really need an introduction, but for form's sake, let me do so. Vikram is the author of 4 highly acclaimed books: The Splendors of Royal Mysore, The Untold Story of the Wadeyars, My Name is Gohar Jan, The Life and Times of a Musician, then The Voice of Veena, a biography of S. Balachandar, and his latest is the first of a 2-volume biography, Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past. It's been published by Penguin Random House and Penguin Random House. Apologies for my mess up in the pronunciation. Penguin, apologies for the mess up in my pronunciation. And thank you so much for partnering with the Nehru Centre in organizing this. I hope some of the Penguin Random House guys are also here. If you are, do give a shout out in the chat. Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past, as I said, is the first of a 2-volume biography, and it went on to become a national bestseller and was acclaimed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji himself. Vikram was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English literature. This was a Yuva Puraskar, so obviously it was 50 years ago. Vikram and he also won the ARC International Award. Vikram was among the 4 writers and artists to be selected as a writer in residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in 2015. This is a rare honor, and it shows how highly Vikram is regarded by those who matter. Vikram has a doctorate in history and music from the University of Queensland, Australia, and is a senior research fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. He is also an Aspen Global Leadership Fellow and an Eisenhower Global Program Fellow in 2021, which makes the relationship with me even stronger, because even I was an Eisenhower Global Program Fellow. But of course, I'm much older than Vikram. Just by 6 months, I'm 106 years old. So I did the fellowship some years back. Vikram is an engineer mathematician by training from BITS Pilani. He's also the founder director of the Bangalore Lit Fest, the Indic Thoughts Festival, and most recently Z Earth Festival, one of the finest Lit Fests being organized these days in India. And we're going to jump straight into the conversation, unless Vikram has something to add to this.
Nothing to my own introduction, Amish, but thank you so much. There's so many similarities, right, from the color of our shirt, as we discussed, to also a mathematics, degree before taking up our passion, an MBA and all of that. And I think the Nehru Centre there and the Nehru Memorial Museum here. True. Eisenhower as well.
You're like a brother from another mother.
Indeed.
Because let's just jump straight into the conversation. And one thing that occurred to me that's truly topical. We are living through a pandemic, okay, at this point in time. Something that is unprecedented in living memory. Humanity has suffered pandemics before, but something on this scale in our living memory has not really happened. And interestingly, there was an epidemic in the 1890s as well, a plague that catapulted young Swatantraveer Savarkar to the revolutionary movement. The Epidemic Diseases Act, which the British enacted in 1897, which is used to this day as well by the government of India, was pretty much in vogue and was brought out at that time. So your thoughts on epidemics and their links to major social changes, and in fact even in the rise of nationalism in the 1890s. And there is a sense that there is a pushback against globalization today. It was happening already. There's a sense that as the pandemic pushed the envelope far further. What's your sense on that?
That's a very interesting and very topical question, Amish. And I think, very strangely, epidemics and diseases and their history with, and their association with human history is so far, it predates, I think, even human migration to cities and agriculture and all of that, and development of urbanization and urban centers. And the outcomes can be positive as well as negative. And several scholars have actually done a lot of work on this whole impact of epidemics on various aspects of social, cultural, and political lives of countries and people. So on the negative side, it leads to a lot of rise of nativism, protectionism, like what we are seeing now of, barricading borders and not ensuring free movement of people across different regions. But on the others, and also there's it's some of the most popular revolts also have blossomed, I think, alongside several epidemics, all through right from the 1830s to the 1910s. You had the cholera epidemic in different parts of the world, and the cholera riots that came up, the social upheavals because of that, they, I think, subsumed entire cities in Europe as well as North America. And on the positive front, we also see a spurt of nationalism, and that largely, especially in the colonial past, where I think the natives were spurred into a spirit of patriotism and nationalism due to what they saw as the colonial masters' unfair treatment or unfair understanding of the victims' sufferings. So, as you mentioned, in the 1890s, we had plague in different parts of India, particularly Maharashtra. And this Epidemic Diseases Act, which we have now enforced in India, was enacted then in 1897. And unlike now, where we have the COVID warriors at the forefront, doctors and nurses, in those days, the British government really did not know how to deal with this pandemic. And all they wanted to do was contain it at any cost because it was affecting their commercial interests. Products from India could not be shipped across to other countries because people were scared that this would lead to spread of the disease. So they had to contain this at any cost. And instead of doctors and nurses, they deployed army officials and soldiers in different parts of India, particularly Maharashtra. And these guys just didn't know how to deal with the situation. So people, they would barge into people's houses, and like now, the stigma around the disease was so high that people would keep the whole aspect of the disease secret. So if a rat was found dead, it would be hushed up, until the time it actually death started coming out, the family would try to contain or conceal this whole information. So soldiers would barge in to make inquiries. Women would be molested. The puja ghars would be desecrated. All kinds of things like this were happening. And several people, including Bal Gangadhar Tilak, had written in the Kesari that which man will stand up and defend the honor of his mother and sister in such a situation that we are put into. And the entire responsibility of doing that was taken up by these brothers called the Chapekar brothers, who actually decided to assassinate the plague commissioner of Pune, Charles Rand and Ayers. And that kind of shook the whole setup. And the Chapekars were Damodar Hari and Balkrishna Hari Chapekar, and the younger brother Vasudev Hari Chapekar. They were all rounded up and executed. And the newspapers were agog with stories of their valor, how they actually went smiling to their news with verses of the Gita on their lips. And so Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who was a young boy in Bhagur, a small village in the Nashik district of Maharashtra, born in a Chitpavan Brahmin family, the same community as the Chapekars, was somewhere so deeply influenced by this incident. And he had lost his mother then to cholera, and he was just a boy of 8 or 9 years old of age. And in front of the family deity, the Ashtabhuja Bhavani, or the eight-handed Bhavani, he takes a vow that Shatrus Marta Marta Mare Tuzunzen in Marathi, which says, till my last breath, I will keep fighting the enemy, and I vow to kill them, not die myself, but actually kill them. And this, what seemed like a very...
marenge.
Marte marenge, exactly. That
Marte
was the
marte marenge, sorry. Marte marte marenge.
that was exactly what came to my mind when the Prime Minister said that about the aggression on our borders. So, so this vow, it seemed like a very childish kind of a vow, but it actually changed the course of history of Indian revolutionary struggle, as also Savarkar's own life. There were also other, benign factors, since you spoke about epidemics, of the whole sense of, service, spirituality, and also, the nationalism, in terms of what Swami Vivekananda was doing right at that time by forming the Plague Committee in Bengal. And Sister Nivedita was the president of this whole association. And they were going into localities and stressing on the three S's: service, spirituality, and I forgot the third S. So, so these, so this kind of sanitation, which became, and the Plague Manifesto that he brought out, I think it's very, very important and pertinent even in today's COVID times. So, a long answer to your short question. So the very, very unprecedented and unexpected responses to diseases and how humankind reacts to them. I think the way we are seeing the protests in the US today, and all of this coming in the midst of an epidemic, social upheavals, radical movements. But at least in the case of India and her history, I think the plague set the foundation for the armed revolutionary struggle in Indian history.
It's interesting you should speak. I mean, the last line that the line that you ended your answer with, the revolutionary movement, it triggers a question in my mind, because it's something Sanjeev Sanyal has also spoken of. Our freedom movement, has privileged, and I'm not belittling the importance of the non-violent movement led by Mahatma Gandhi, but there was another entire stream of an independence movement, the revolutionary struggle. And so many greats, Rash Bihari Bose, Bhagat Singh has been remembered, Subhash Chandra Bose, that entire stream. Swatantra Veer Savarkar would also fall in that stream. But this stream of our independence movement has been airbrushed out of our history.
True.
And out of our narrative, almost. What is your sense of this, of the point that I've raised, and what is your sense of the importance of this, of this stream of our independence movement to us actually getting independence, including what happened with the naval mutiny in 46? That was an entire different stream of the independence struggle.
True.
What's your view as a scholar? What's your view of this?
No, that's extremely pertinent, because I think for history is the handmaiden of the ruler. So, the narrative, he who controls the past, I think controls the future, as George Orwell had said. I think along with that, it's also who controls the present too. So for the longest time, we've had a very, very, as you said, very airbrushed kind of view, a monochromatic, very simplistic, linear narrative of how the independence struggle happened in India. But if you flip that entire narrative and look at the armed struggle, which was happening continuously with a few, troughs and a lot of peaks, I would trace it back right to the 1857 uprising, which shook the foundations of the British Raj, and which forced them to actually, the East India Company to go out of favor, and India coming directly under the Queen. And the declaration of 1858 that the British Parliament brought out. So right from there till 1946, as you mentioned, there was an unending chain, an unending stream of armed struggle almost across different parts of the country. Largely, initially it was, of course, in Maharashtra, in Bengal, and Punjab, and then large parts of the United Provinces, which was Uttar Pradesh then, and other parts also got enveloped into this. And from Vasudev Balwant Phadke, whom I cover in the book, as well as the Chapekars, whom I mentioned, Tilak to all the others, right through the 1920s. You had Prafulla Kumar Chaki, Khudiram Bose. You had people like Jatin Das, who was called Baga Jatin, and and later, of course, Raj Bihari Bose, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, and culminating in Netaji, with Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. So this stream has seldom, even in our history books, they probably just come as one small chapter or a small, paragraph, not even a chapter. And more disparagingly, I mean, you've had very eminent historians who, in school and college textbooks, have dubbed these people as terrorists. So, when a young man or woman in India today or outside reads these books and is also looking at what's happening in India, in Kashmir, in the Naxal-dominated areas, and the nomenclature for those people is terrorists, and you also hear that Bhagat Singh was a terrorist, then you kind of know what imagery comes to the mind of a young person. Which is very, very sad. In fact, truth be told, I think we won our independence not because of the several movements that were going on, which, as you said, not disparaging them, they had their role, they had their importance in galvanizing us as a country. We never, I mean, 10 Indians you put in a room, I think they will keep fighting with each other. They will have nothing in common to agree upon.
We put 10 Indians in a room, we'll have 11 opinions.
Very, very true.
One of the cute things about us. We'll never agree.
We shall agree to disagree.
But
to
some
that
great leaders united us.
Yes,
including leaders like Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yeah, no, I mean, Subhash Chandra Bose was a outcast in the Congress, and the way he was shunted out of the Congress in 1939, despite he being elected. So, in fact, it was the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, after independence, when he comes to India, I think 1951 or 52, he goes to Calcutta, and there's Justice Chaudhary, somebody in the Calcutta High Court, who talks to him, and Clement Attlee was the Prime Minister when the transfer of power happened, and he asked, why did you actually give us freedom? Why did you take this ultimate step? And he said the main concern was the mutiny in the Navy, which was engineered by the INA, the Indian National Army, and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And the British were always petrified of a repeat of 1857. That was a ghost that always hung on them, on their minds all the time. And so he explicitly, even when I saw British records in the British Library in London, the amount of official communication between Indian capital of Delhi or various governors of India to the Viceroy and to the Secretary of State in London was all around how is the army doing, how is there Bagawat revolt happening there, because the British knew that once the army goes in uprising, they had already been weakened after the World War. There was no way that they could continue ruling India, and so Mountbatten was clearly given this mandate that from that wreckage just rescue as many of countrymen and women and come back. So this sort of thing, and then Clement Attlee also, somebody asked him, the same person asked him that what was Gandhiji's contribution to the ultimate decision you took to grant us freedom, and he says almost negligible. So I mean, I'm just quoting what he said. So we see what narrative actually ruled, and what is being taught to us and brainwashed for several generations. But I think now people are at least open to the idea of looking at these alternative narratives, the subaltern voice, so to say, as all Marxist historians love to use that word all the time.
There is, it triggers a thought in my mind that do you think at times nuance has been lost, where we see things at a simplistic level, that we're doing this event at the Nehru Centre. So we either have to see Swatantra Veer Savarkar as someone very wrong and Prime Minister Nehru is very good, or vice versa.
True.
And perhaps if you see it in a nuanced way, was there, and in the traditional Indian way, where we saw good in everyone and bad in everyone as well. Do you think at times that nuance has been lost, and how would you compare Prime Minister Nehru and Swatantra Veer Savarkar in there? Do you think one was patriotic, the other wasn't? Do you think one was? Or how would you see it?
I think that would just be stretching it like probably what happens on social media these days to kind of elevate one person. The other viewpoint need not be suppressed, and that's or disparaged or spoken disparagingly of, which is sadly what has happened, I think, with Savarkar's narrative. I'll tell you, Amish, I mean, the last biography of Savarkar was written in the 1960s by this man called Dhananjay Keer. When Savarkar was still around. He died in 1966. So can you imagine that from 1960s to now, 2020, we didn't have people writing a full-fledged biography of this man whom so many people love to love and love to hate. But despite that, you don't want to invest time and your intellect in trying to resurrect as to what is it about this man that you even hate. I have no problem with people disagreeing with his views. He had very, very radical views. He was a controversial figure. It's fine if you disagree. There's no need to, as you said, 10 Indians will have 11 views. I think with Savarkar, they would have 100 views, even those 10 people, because he was that kind of a man who evoked or triggered very radical responses. But then at least Baba just study the person, and not only him, he was a persona non grata, but anybody even associated with him, remotely, would have to face the government ire. Way back in the 1970s, you had Hridaynath Mangeshkar, someone as celebrated as him, Lata Mangeshkar's brother and the famous musician. The entire Mangeshkar family was very close to Savarkar, and so Savarkar was also a very prolific poet in Marathi. So a lot of his poems, Jayostute, Shri Mahan Mangale, Shivaspade Shubhade, that famous patriotic song, and many other poems, the Mangeshkars actually tuned, and Lata used to sing them, and Hridaynath Mangeshkar was with the All India Radio. Now, because of the family's closeness to Savarkar, Hridaynath was actually, he lost his job from the All India Radio. And so this was the kind of vilification. So you can imagine what the main person would have received in terms of propaganda against him. So those who were you could not even talk about him. So the minute you spoke or had a discussion, you were marked as, for vilification. So today, at least the situation is open enough, so to say. So I think to your question about nuance, it was like this with respect to him, at least all through. And today, at least the अच्छे दिन आ गए हैं कि at least we can sit and have this discussion, and through the Nehru Centre and an NMML gives a historian, a research fellowship to study on him, which is quite a change in the times, which is welcome. Because as I said, agreeing or disagreeing with historical figures based on what they could or should have done retrospectively, sitting in our air-conditioned rooms, I think we have the luxury of that to decide. But at least study them. And this vilification of one is patriotic, one is a Desh Drohi and all that, traitor, I think that narrative needs to go. They've all sacrificed, they've all suffered various degrees of sufferings. Their families have suffered, and today we are breathing fresh air in India thanks to the collective efforts of all of them. So of course they would have failings. So Nehru too had his colossal Himalayan blunders, as they said, and so did Savarkar. And I'm really not the fanboy who's trying to whitewash every act or statement that Savarkar makes. He had his failings, as all of us as humans would. So let's humanize our figures and not make Gandhis out of them, idolization, so that the person, anybody who says anything against it is an iconoclast and has to be derided. So I think that needs to go. And I hope more books, critiques for, against get written. I mean, in the West, how many books get written on Hitler? Though I don't know, I don't think anybody supports him, but at least there are viewpoints, there's new research that comes about, which sadly with Savarkar is not seen.
No, and Vikram, what you're saying is truly the actual traditional Indian approach of seeing things from a nuanced perspective, having no concept of blasphemy. We didn't have the word blasphemy in Vedic Sanskrit. Everything was up for questioning, and the wonderful search for knowledge, for the blessings of Goddess Saraswati. No, what a wonderful way to put it. Thank you for that, Vikram. And actually, just a thought when you spoke of, Savarkar ji's literary output. Because he's written some wonderful work, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Written on the 1857
Hmm.
First War of Independence, in the biography of Manzini. Uh, but there is a very, very famous Marathi poem that
Hmm.
he written, Sagara
Yeah.
Prana Tadamadala. And
Yes.
he written it
Yeah.
at Brighton. For those who've traveled to Brighton and may not know, literally translates as how his heart, uh, how does one translate Tadamadala? Palpitates, perhaps, yeah? His
Uh,
heart, and he's thinking of
Tormented.
India. Yeah.
Hmm. Tormented.
He's
Yeah.
thinking of Mother India.
Yeah.
And it is something that all Indians, living outside India, including someone like me living in London, just that poem can bring tears to our eyes because we miss Mother India.
True.
Uh,
True.
Take us through his literary skills,
Hmm.
take us through what he wrote, and take us through this poem.
Yes.
For those who don't know Marathi, who've not had the pleasure of listening to this
Right.
wonderful poem.
That's a very nice thing to talk about, because very few people would talk about the literary aspect of Savarkar. And I think if he probably had not involved himself in politics, he would have been a Sahityakar of great eminence, which he continues to be, but he would have been remembered as a Sahityakar of great eminence in Marathi. And right from his childhood, when he was 9 or 10, poetry germinated in him. And I think it was the loss of his mother, when I look at it that way, that sensitized him. And almost every time when there was a calamity in his life, he took to poetry. And even when he jumps the ship in Marseille in France, and he's brought back into by the British soldiers back into the ship to be extradited to India, he composes there this poem and starts singing it, called Anadi Me Anantami. It's almost like mocking the soldiers, saying, "You may have caught me, but I am Anant. I'm infinite.
Correct.
My soul cannot be captured." So, the entire, and in cellular jail, they were denied paper and pen. So with his nails, he would actually inscribe poems on the walls of his cell. And 6,000 verses, Amish, not just one or two, 6,000 verses of poetry, Marathi poetry, Kamala, Saptarshi, were inscribed that way in those terrible conditions that he faced in jail. And to spite him, the jailer would come and whitewash the walls in front of him so that all the verses would go away. But then this guy had an elephantine memory. So he'd committed all of that to memory. And on coming back, all these poems were then published. So he was also a playwright who wrote several plays right from his childhood. And later on issues of social issues like untouchability, and largely around this whole concept of giving India a sense of her history. He was also a historian. So as you mentioned, he coined the phrase, the first war of
First War of
independence.
Independence.
I
Used
think
to be
what
derisively called Sepoy Mutiny.
Exactly. So I think that's what the Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, when he mentioned that, but for Savarkar, the 1857 would have been committed to a footnote, as a few soldiers here and there, they just did something because of that beef lard and pork cartridges, and that's what it was. But then and the beauty was staying in London. He was in London, where you are, 5 years.
India House. This was
India
at India
House.
House, right? Where? Yeah.
It's not the same India House. I think I think the commission now is called India House, but this India
Yeah.
House was at Highgate, and unfortunately, it's occupied by someone else. Though it has that blue plaque, which the London Municipal Corporation puts. So a lot of us go there and take selfies, and I think the residents of that house are so miffed, by so many people.
A cool thing would be to run a program. This was an idea given to me by the Director General of ICCR, Dinesh Patnaik ji, that we should find places where freedom fighters have been in London and other parts of the UK, and work with the UK government and put tricolor plaques and just commemorate them. I think that would be a damn cool idea.
Yeah.
But sorry to distract you. Come back again.
So yeah, even I'd gone there and taken photographs, and someone peeped out saying, "Oh," and they must have got so used to all of us Browns coming there and taking photographs and disturbing them. So, but then, so while he was there too, he composed. That's where he actually researched on the 1857, mutiny, as it was called, with the British records in the British Library for almost 2 long years. And then it was almost like using the records of the British to build a narrative which is with an Indian perspective. And that was exactly what was done through that book. And that book itself, Amish, became such a landmark. It was the first book in the history of the world which was banned before even it was published. So, and the manuscripts were actually smuggled back to India in those false bottom boxes. So there was something else at the bottom, and on the top there would be some Christmas gifts and Pickwick papers and all kinds of fanciful names, and they would be smuggled to India. It was sent to his elder brother Baba Rao in India. He tried to get it published here, but there was surveillance. Both Scotland Yard as well as the Indian intelligence were always behind the brothers and trying to see what was happening. And the Viceroy, Lord Minto itself, had written to the Secretary of State saying this book by Savarkar should be prevented from coming to India at any cost. And the Sea Customs Act was put on it so that it could not come. But despite that, this book comes. It is not able. They're not able to publish it in India, so it's again smuggled back to Europe. It goes to Paris. There also the French police try to get it. From there, the book makes a travel to Germany, where they thought, it was in Marathi, so probably the Indology scholars there would know the Devanagari script and be able to write it. But they made a mess of the whole type setting, and so then again it was withdrawn from there, taken to Belgium, and circumventing all these customs officials in the borders, and finally, and also translated to English by his associate VVS Iyer. And this book then comes back to India. And this book on 1857, along with that biography of Mazzini, the Italian revolutionary, becomes almost like the Bible for Indian revolutionaries for 20, 30 years after he wrote. He wrote it in 1909, 1908, 1909. But then 2 decades later, Bhagat Singh actually publishes the second edition of this book. And in my research, I was quite surprised. In the Nehru Library in Delhi, there was an interview transcript of a former revolutionary who later becomes a Congress member, Durgadas Khanna in Punjab, who says when Bhagat Singh actually and Sukhdev interviewed him to join the HSRA, one of the questions they asked him was, have you read Savarkar's 1857 book? And have you read The Life of Barrister Savarkar by Chitragupta? So these books were almost like an entry criteria to enter into the revolutionary struggle. And 2 decades later, in the 1940s, in the raids on the INA officials, copies of the book were found in tatters there too, including Tamil versions and so on in different parts of India. There was a Japanese version which Rash Bihari Bose and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had got published, and it was found in Japan. So, so the kind of impact that, and as writers we can take a lot of that the British considered a man who actually never wielded a weapon in his life.
Dangerous.
So dangerous. He was actually classified as D category or a dangerous criminal, and that's why they just wanted to get rid of him at any cost and send him away to Port Blair, far, far away from the mainland India. And about your...
So, it showed also in, the unfair trials that he faced, the way he was treated at Marseille, the fact that they went for arbitration to the International Court of Justice.
True.
And the tortures that he faced at what was the Indian Bastille.
Correct.
The cellular jail, the Kala Pani. Not enough Indians are taught of our standard history doesn't have that.
True.
The horrors of Kalapani cellular jail.
True.
It is no way less than Bastille, no way less than among the worst crimes committed by European fascists or European Nazis or European Marxists on those that they hate.
Very true.
Tell us a bit about the kind of horrors that happened at cellular jail, and why do you think again that this, we just don't know, we aren't taught about it.
True. What happened?
Sandeep, someone is sharing their screen. Can you stop them, please? Thank you. Just carry on with your answer.
So Amish, I think I forgot to answer your other, before I get to Kalapani, I'll just, you had mentioned about that poem, I think someone else had written in the comments too. So that since it has this UK connection, and a little before that, considering, we're talking through London, in those 5 years in London, I think again, names that you said are never remembered and spoken of. The protagonists who were operating with Savarkar, young men, from different parts of India. And I think through this session, we
I'm so
offer
sorry, Vikram. Vikram, just give me one sec. Sandeep, can
Yes.
you please remove this participant, please?
Yes, I'm finding.
Thank you. Sorry, Vikram. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think, someone tries to disrupt a Savarkar session all the time, right? so
Someone is, Dennis Doble is
Yes.
sharing the screen. Dennis Doble, if you can please stop sharing your screen. Thank
with
you.
a lot of peacock feathers or whatever.
You're hijacking the event. Dennis Doble, please. DENISDOBLE.
Scotland Yard
Vikram,
by any
carry on.
chance?
Okay, awesome.
Scotland Yard by any chance?
Go ahead, Vikram. Yeah.
So I think through this session, a little tribute I think we owe to all these heroes who were there in London, in those 5 years. Starting with, of course, Shyamji Krishnavarma, the colossus of that entire movement, who actually used to give scholarships to young Indians to come, and he had established the India House at Highgate. And Madam Bhikaji Kama, that ferocious Indian Joan of Arc, a Parsi woman from Bombay who was married, and then she leaves everything and comes over, becomes initially an assistant of Dadabhai Nauroji, and later takes to the radical movement. And young men, as I said, coming from different parts. India House was like a microcosm of the whole of India. You had Lala Hardayal from Delhi, you had from Punjab, you had someone like Madan Lal Dhingra, you had Bhai Parmanand. From the south, you had from Madras, you had VVS Iyer.
Madan Lal Dhingra ji was executed when...
yes, he assassinated a British...
Savarkar was here.
Yes, he was his protege. And so... and then you had MPT Acharya from Mysore Brahmin who come there. You had Virendranath Chattopadhyay, this famous, the brother of Sarojini Naidu actually, and a very, very maverick, very jolly, fun-loving revolutionary who was there, on whose life actually Somerset Maugham actually had a character in his Ashen Den also on an Indian revolutionary's life. So he was a very colorful, he had an Irish girlfriend living in with her and all of that. And Senapati Bapat, MPT Acharya, all these people who were there. And so they were cyclostyling bomb manuals from across Europe, translating that, sending it back to India, and that's what was causing all these bomb explosions in different parts of India, to make the deaf hear, as Bhagat Singh had later said, and political assassinations too. Back in Nashik, there was Anant Lakshman Kanhere who assassinated the Nashik district magistrate through a pistol, a Browning pistol, which Savarkar had sent or smuggled back to India. And in London, it was Madan Lal Dhingra who had got into this mad frenzy. Someone again who was a very jolly guy who was studying engineering there. And all of them, taking loans or mortgaging their property, they had come to London or different parts of Britain to study and make their life. And suddenly something happens to them. They all go to the extent of giving up their life. Lala Hardayal was a scholar at Oxford, Bowden scholar in Sanskrit, and from St. Stephen's in Delhi, such an erudite scholar, leaves everything, the scholarship included, and forms the Gadar Party. And this Gadar Party organizes the revolution across continents, North America, Canada, Europe, Southeast Asia, all through the period of the First World War and thereafter. So, and such a sad travesty that we don't even know their names. So when Madan Lal Dhingra is, executed, Savarkar is holed up, the India House is holed up and closed, and he goes away to Brighton. And that's where, and I thought I'll just read a little paragraph from the book, where he says, where I say rather, that physically and emotionally exhausted and broken, Vinayak left London for Brighton, a seaside town. On the evening of 10th December 1909, he was sitting by the Brighton beach with his friend Niranjan Pal, Bipin Chandra Pal's son. All around him, happy families, parents and their children were enjoying the lovely weather, the sea, the surf and sand. Vinayak was overwhelmed with intense pathos and longing for his motherland. Everything suddenly seemed to have been shattered. His professional and personal lives were in tatters. But more importantly, he felt that he had himself been a colossal failure in his sacred mission, the armed struggle to liberate his motherland that he had set out upon. Dhingra's execution, the public ostracism and shaming that followed, and constantly being on the run from the Scotland Yard were taking their toll on him. Niranjan Pal described that poignant moment. Presently, he commenced to hum a song he sang as he composed. It was a Marathi song describing the pitiable serfdom of India. Forgetful of everything else, Savarkar went on singing. Presently, tears began to roll down his cheeks. His voice became choked, he sobbed, but he still sang. The song remained unfinished. He burst and began to weep like a child. This catharsis manifested itself in the form of that immortal melody that has haunted innumerable people ever since. Ne majasi ne parat matra bhumila sagara pran talamadala. The classic poem which actually says, "O ocean, take me back to my motherland. My soul is in so much torment here. I was cheated by you that I will come to Britain to learn and also help my motherland. But of what use is all my education if I'm not able to help her while she cries there? I'm enjoying the luxuries of life here." So that was the poem that Lata Mangeshkar, I think it's on YouTube also, and everyone should probably listen to that. It just stirs up emotions of people who listen to it.
You should. Those of you who are patriotic, which I assume is all of you, go check it out, man. Go check it out. You will be inspired.
Yeah, and so on the whole, yeah. Sorry, you had asked about the Port Blair thing. So yeah, he was actually given the Fugitive and Offenders Act, which was slapped on him. He was not a fugitive. He was a bona fide student who had come there on a scholarship. But this is put because the British, I mean, Churchill also notes in the office records that at any cost, get this guy back. And so that's one reason why when he jumps off ship in Masai, so he was a lawyer. He was studying law there. So he knew the loopholes of the law. So he said, now I've got onto French soil. And so the Britain has lost its right on me. And so if I need to be extradited to India, it is the French decision, either to give me to Britain or to give me asylum. And so that's how this case goes to Hague, to the International Court of Justice, like what we are having with Kulbhushan Jadhav now between India and Pakistan. And then Britain somehow arm twists France and ensures that Savarkar loses the case, and he's sent back to India, tried there without a jury, without a lawyer. And so the outcome was fixed. And so he was meted out the strongest punishment of 2 life terms, or 2 transportations for life, as it was called, amounting to 50 long years. So just imagine a young man who was 28, 29 with a bright career, who was actually studying law for 50 years. If he's sent to this hellhole, if he comes out at all, what sort of future would he ever have, or a family life or anything? He was already married by then. So nothing of that would remain. And the kind of tortures there under this, captain of the hell called Barry, who was there, was indescribable. And he writes, and he and several other revolutionaries, they were close to about 400 revolutionaries, largely from Bengal and a few from Maharashtra. And later, lots of them started coming from Punjab. They were, and interestingly, no congressmen who were ever lodged in the cellular jail. It was only the revolutionaries who were put there, and they were put to so much torture. Basic human rights of toilet facilities or good food was not given to them, and if you had to, there were only fixed timings when you could go to ease yourself. And so the food that they got was largely with pieces of reptiles and snakes and all of that. And then eating that, most of them would end up with diarrhea. And for that, if you had to go to the toilet, you were not allowed, you were flogged. And so most of them had to defecate in their own cells, and sitting, sleeping, eating in that squalor. You can imagine what that would be. And all day, the punishment that they got was this koluka bell, where they were yoked to that oil grinding mill, and instead of the bullock, the revolutionary was put there. And full day in the blazing heat of Port Blair, they had to extract 30 pounds of oil. And if they did not extract that, they were flogged, they were whipped, and they were not given food, which they even didn't want to eat. And medical facilities were denied to them. And these are aspects of our history which, forget the British, I mean, even Indians don't know. And there are names of all the people. I think the Port Blair and that cellular jail needs to become a site of pilgrimage for all Indian students in school who should go there and visit and see what it is for themselves. And Savarkar was put in solitary confinement. Today in quarantine, in our luxurious homes, we are all going bonkers. Whereas this man, 6 months, no human contact, and standing handcuffs, and where everything you urinate, you defecate, everything standing. And the only human contact was his cell overlooked the gallows. So every day you were seeing people who are screaming and shouting and being led to their death. So so many of the revolutionaries, Indu Bhushan Roy and Ulaskar Dutt and others, they all either committed suicide or they actually went mad. So there was in fact an entire asylum that the British started at Port Blair called in the Haddo Island, an asylum only to keep all these lunatics who all went mad only because of the tortures, because death seemed better than life. And in such a situation, this man was writing poems, as I said, on the walls of the cell, and he writes in his memoirs too, Maji Janma Tape, or My Transportation for Life, that it was Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and meditation that I did. And he himself admits many times, I had these thoughts of committing suicide myself, but then I took it upon myself that not only should I prevent, taking my life, but I should also become a leader for the others. And they all called him Bada Babu. And so he would prevent most people from taking the excessive step of taking their lives off. And slowly the situation comes to such an extent that there are jail reforms that he brings about in cellular jail. There's a library that started. There are, classes to teach languages. He was a great proponent of Hindi as the unifying language for India. So, but at the same time, all languages of India needed to be taught for national integration. So a Bengali prisoner would teach the other prisoners, the little Bengali, a Gujarati, Marathi, all these languages were spoken, taught among each other. Spiritual books of different religions were read by all the prisoners. So from that extreme torture to in the 11, 12 years that he spent there, he managed to even usher in those kind of jail reforms, which I think Madam Kiran Bedi would be very proud of what she did in Tihar. So
there is this oft-repeated charge, right, of the mercy petitions he wrote when he was there, and it's presented as that he sold out to the British. What's your take on that?
Oh, I think that's such a perverse way of looking at it, Amish. And petitions were a very legitimate way of, which was a instrument that was not offered only to Savarkar, but for all the political prisoners. And he was a lawyer, as I said.
I'm not saying I agree with those interpretations, but I want
Indeed.
to ask you. I certainly don't.
So when someone is going through this kind of torture, and often, the comparison is, but Bhagat Singh did not, file it, and he took to the gallows. Now, the prisoner cannot choose what sort of punishment he gets, right? I mean, he was given execution, whereas this man was given 50 years of imprisonment. And this was a instrument that was allowed. Just as you could have a lawyer to defend your case, you could also give a petition. And so he was a, consistent petitioner and fighting for the rights, not only of himself, but of all the other prisoners, whom, as I said, he was the spokesperson, so to say. So in 1917, he writes a petition where he says, if my release actually construes an obstacle to the release of all the other prisoners, then stop my release and release all the others, if you may, and that will give me as much pleasure as my own release would do. So, and the British itself, there was a Home Department officer called Reginald Craddock who comes to interview all these prisoners because there were alarming reports that Savarkar had started bomb manufacture even in Port Blair in the jungles. So they had to come and interview him and find out what his grievances were. And Reginald Craddock, in his official document, says, I interviewed him and he shows no sense of apology or remorse for whatever he has done. So, and his fellow prisoners too, Sanjeev Sanyal's grand uncle, Sachindranath Sanyal, who was there in the prison there, in his autobiography in Hindi, Mera Bandi Jeevan, he says, Savarkar advised all of us to write petitions. It was a format in which all of them wrote the petition. I also wrote it, but I was released, but he was not released because the British were so fearful of him, and they felt that if he was released, then the revolutionary zeal that had gone off in the Bombay presidency would catch up yet again. And interestingly, when his younger brother Narayan Rao approaches Mahatma Gandhi and says in 1920 that both my brothers, Baba Rao was also in the same cellular jail, and the two brothers hadn't even met or known that they were in the same jail for so many years of being there. Both of them are rotting there. So can you intervene? You're a national leader. So Gandhiji himself says, ask your brothers to file a petition. And Gandhi himself files a petition on Savarkar brothers' behalf, saying, they have been brave people, probably misguided. Now they want to come back to the constitutional process because the Morley-Minto reforms had kicked in. So they want to assist the Congress. So please, let them off. And most of the people who were given a long sentence, 25, 30, 40 years, they were all let off, during the World War. You had Emperor George's royal proclamation. All of this were coming. So not only in India, but in different colonies to kind of create goodwill among the natives. So under that thing, obviously someone who's jailed would try to kind of use all the tech tools in his command to get out. Who would want to say, I'll want to stand in that jail all day and defecate in my cell? I mean, what is achieved by that? You would rather come out, make all these promises saying, okay, I will not participate in politics. I will not do this. So Sachindranath Sanyal also did that. But then he came out and then he formed the HRA and
started it again.
Kakori case and, the brain behind Bhagat Singh's this one. So I think this whole hawa that is set up of...
Many of the revolutionaries had that approach, Shate Shatyam Samacharit. The British aren't honorable, so with them, the British Raj. So therefore tell them whatever you need to get out and start the revolution.
Get out. True,
Shate
very
Shatyam
true.
Samacharit. Dushta ke saath dushtata hi karni chahiye.
True.
There is a whole bunch of questions coming up which I'll need to jump into because we're already at 12:50 UK time. I'm just going to have one last question with you, the audience. If you could give me, the leave for that, please. So it's kind of like a joint question. One, when one reads of Swatantra Veer Savarkar, and in your book, he comes across as a very rational, modern thinker, advocated a casteless society for science, technology. So in that sense, he was in many ways a reformer. Right?
Yeah.
That's one aspect, and secondly, that's what makes his story a little intriguing. Because in London, he was also speaking of Hindu-Muslim unity, right? But later began to be seen as an anti-Muslim leader. What's your view on both these aspects of him? And then we can jump into the questions that others have.
Yeah. Well, that's a fabulous question, because that's when you think of Savarkar, the first image that comes is of what in contemporary parlance you would call an Islamophobe. But then, as you pointed out, in London in the 1857 book too, he talks of Hindu-Muslim unity, of how we are all a rainbow of colors, and Mother India is a combination of all of this, etc. I think the change happened due to two reasons. One was his experience at cellular jail, where the British, again, with their usual divide and rule policy, they put largely the Muslim Pathans from the northwest frontier province as the Jamadars in the cell. And so the Hindus were quite unfairly treated. They were not, in fact, he writes, right when someone enters, the first thing is your sacred thread was cut off, and your religious freedom was not permitted, and with that kind of tortures given, many of the Hindus who were probably weak-minded, they would say, if you convert to Islam, then we will reduce your torture. So we have how many of a crore gods, ab ek aur Allah ko usme jod do, koi fark nahi padta. So you would at least get some good food to eat. So many of them jumped ship and went on to the other side, and that kind of stirred in him, and there was no mechanism in Hinduism to reconvert them, because we are not a proselytizing religion. So then he begins this whole Shuddhi movement inspired by the Arya Samaj in the jail. So where those who had crossed over and wanted to come back, they could be brought back into the fold. And that's when he also, understands the disunity that the Hindu community suffered, which was the core reason, our caste system and all the problems that we face, untouchability. And that's how he brings out his seminal treatise, Essentials of Hindutva, in jail in 1923, and which kind of changed the scene of Indian politics and continues to as we speak. where he defines a Hindu not by the religious or the theological construct of the word, but as a cultural and a nationalistic, identity marker. Asindhu Sindhu Paryanta Yasya Bharata Bhumika. So anybody who is staying between the Indus and the seas, and who considers this land, this sacred geography, as their Punya Bhu and Pitru Bhu, the land of their ancestors and their holy land, would be considered as a Hindu, and not again as the religious term, but and that's how the world looks at us. Everyone calls us Indians as Hindu, irrespective of which religion you belong to. So let's give that sense of identity. The second reason was, I think there was a very terrible and dangerous movement that was going on in India at that time, which to my mind sowed the seeds of partition of the country, which was the Khilafat movement, which Gandhiji had launched, all with the right good intentions of bringing about unity between the two communities and bringing Muslims into the freedom movement. But it was actually communal mobilization, where on a very sensitive communal issue of re-establishment of the caliphate, thousands of kilometers away from India in Turkey, you were mobilizing Indian Muslims to fight for that cause, almost giving this extraterritorial allegiance to some other country. When your own country is in peril and under colonial domination, why would you want your citizens to fight for some other country, and also peg the support of a community to the national freedom struggle, to the bait that you offer to them, saying, if you come and participate in our freedom struggle, we will come and support you in your quest for establishment of a caliphate in Turkey. How does that affect the life of an Indian Muslim, whether there's a caliph sitting there or there's Mustafa Kemal Ataturk who later took over? So, and the outcome of that, and Gandhiji had promised that within 1 year, the country is going to get both Swaraj and the caliphate is going to be established. Now, both of that did not happen. And the outcome was terrible, because when you communally mobilize people, the mob goes out of the control of even the person who was mobilizing. So you had communal riots in different parts of India. The Mopla carnage in Malabar, you had riots in Kohat, in Panipat, in Calcutta, Bengal, different parts of the country. And every time, the Congress and particularly Gandhi's response was highly, pusillanimous. And even when Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj is murdered by a fanatic called Abdul Rashid, Gandhi says, he's my dear brother Abdul Rashid. I do not consider him as a criminal. We need to understand the psyche of the assassin and all of that. So all this was making, I think, the Hindu community highly, one was they were already fractured into all these castes and untouchability and all these other scourges, which Savarkar strove to reform and bring everyone together. One of the social reformers whom even Dr. Ambedkar was highly in praise of. At the same time, he also wanted to give that spirit of, Hindu Sangathan or unity among them, and bring back that martial spirit which had died, among most of the community.
Most important to have, a feeling of unity right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. So I'm going to jump into questions here.
Yeah.
The first, a very easy one, Nikhil Tamhane, is when is your volume 2 being released?
Oh God, I get asked this all the time, but yeah, the initial idea was to get it out this year end, but with this lockdown, and considering how it is, Amish, with books like this, you need to do so much of research and travel, and I need to spend a lot of time in your place in London and in Delhi and the National Archives in Bombay and all these places, and I'm unable to travel anywhere. And the next part actually covers some very, very important aspects of his life, including the Gandhi murder, in which he was accused of and then acquitted for lack of evidence. So there are 11,000 odd pages of the trial paper sitting in the National Archives of India in Delhi. Now, first to go there, get it in this quarantine period and read, assimilate and bring out, and that's going to be a task. So Penguin and my editor Premanko, who's probably on the call too, he's been very gracious in pushing the deadline to probably the middle of next year, when because there's no point in bringing out something that is based on half-baked information. It's better that it's an exhaustive bibliography and end notes, so that anybody who wants to disparage the book, which luckily nobody has done, because to do that you will have to do double the amount of research that I have done, right? So that's going to be a tough task. That's the whole idea. Even if it is late, I think it's okay. But I think the information that is screaming to be told, needs to come out. In the Nehru Library, Amish, where I am, there are the Savarkar private papers running to almost 40-50,000, slides
40,
or
50,000. Wow.
microfilm slides. And these are right from 1926 till his death. And because he was on surveillance, both by the British as well as by Nehru's government. And so every letter that went in and out of his house was intercepted and kept. So there are copies of that. And no historians who disparage him and talk all over, nobody has even access. When I go there and see the library register, the last access date is somewhere in the 1970s or 80s, even before I was born. So nobody has even read those. So it takes a lot of tenacity to sit there, and the bureaucratic hassle more about.
I will not speak of that publicly.
एक दिन में सिर्फ एक फाइल, एक दिन में सिर्फ 5 फाइल, उसमें एक पर्ची भरो, ये करो. So I'm not quibbing, but then I mean these are the practical difficulties of research in India. In London, it's such a breeze at the British Library. You can get everything.
Things are digitized. We need to start digitizing. But a suggestion to Penguin and to you said your editor is who?
Premanko
Goswami, suggestion to Penguin and Premanko, don't delay the deadline any further. Okay, Anushka, the way, what do you feel is the main lesson from Savarkar ji and his life that Indians should adopt going forward?
Wow, that's a very tough question. I mean, there are so many lessons in terms of, and I keep saying, the whole idea of a united India, and this whole, and right from childhood, his fascination with this utilitarian theory of Spencer and Bentham and Mill and all these other British philosophers. It was like, and he actually correlated that to the Gita and said Lord Krishna was the first utilitarian person, Sarva Jana Hitaya, Sarva Jana Sukhaya. So where he talks of not of pleasing people, but of creating as much welfare to as many people. So the whole idea of India first, of again that whole marte marenge, where you are not going to take any aggression by any enemy lying down and keep sending dossiers and candlelight marches and all that. If somebody doesn't agree with you, even after all these peace emissaries, just as what Krishna did till the last, let's fight for peace. But after that, if the war becomes essential, then so be it. And annihilation of evil is what is most important. And I think that sort of Atmanirbhar Bharat that we now talk of, I think that was repeatedly one of the core ideas of his, in addition to what I said, this whole unification of Indian society, and looking not at piecemeal reforms, but at a complete dismantlement of the caste system. And he would always argue that the Varnashram system is not something that is part of Sanatan Dharma. It's not something that is immutable. Sanatan is something that is immutable, whereas this has had so many mutations. Among the Brahmins, you have thousands of subcastes. Then what is immutable about it? And so it is causing more harm to our society than good. And so it has to be done away with. Anything that is non-utilitarian has to be done away with without any emotional attachment of my faith and my religion and all of that, and including cow worship, about which he had such radical thoughts that it's okay. I mean, if between the country and human life and this animal, the former takes precedence. And so you can imagine how much it would have riled the Orthodox then, as it probably does now in India.
Very radical thought. That is a very radical thought. Samved Iyer is asking, he's saying that Amish has written an excellent book on Suhail Dev. Thank you, Samved. And
Wow.
has Dr. Sampath considered writing a non-fiction book on Suhail Dev after studying primary sources? Yeah, I'd love it if you do that.
Yeah, I mean, Amish had tweeted that. Amish had sent his book, as he always does, and this time with such a lovely, packing. Amish, that jute cover was, I think, a fabulous idea. Whoever's thought of it's probably you.
Yeah, my team in Mumbai. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in fact, when I tweeted it, I think you did reply saying that someday you would want to see a non-fiction book based on sources. I am actually thinking of not only Suhail Dev, but a group of several others across the country on whom a collection of biographies or a monograph could be written of heroes whom we have forgotten, about whom we can be genuinely proud of, and who give us this sense that we are not a country of losers. And, after so many centuries, if we are still around, there must have been some battle that we must have won. And so
Correct.
it's not our history, right from the Battle of Tarain to the Battle of Panipat to everything, Buxar and Plassey, we are just losing war after war. And what have we won, I wonder sometimes. So,
And it's
I
a
think,
valid question that if we lost every war, how come we are still alive?
correct,
The only
correct.
pre-Bronze Age culture that is still alive. Every other pre-Bronze Age culture has been wiped out.
It's gone. Yeah,
Still, we would have won some.
Yeah, true. And our civilizational outreach, someone is talking about the great Cholas here. So to Southeast Asia, or to Suhail Dev, who ensured that the Ghaznavid forces did not come for 175 years. That's some amount of valor. And what about Martanda Varma, who beat
Battle of Kolachal.
Battle of Kolachal, and beat the Dutch East India Company black and blue, and they lost their global power. In any other country, Martanda Varma would be a feated ruler, whereas I think outside Kerala, nobody knows who this man is. In my state, you had Rani Abbakka in Ullal, who beat the Portuguese, a woman who could do this, and the three queens of Ullal, the Rani Abbakka and several others. I mean, women to have been given a short shrift in our history. Their stories have not been told. Durgavati or Chand Bibi or Ahilya Bai Holkar and all these people, I think they all deserve to be resurrected and told in a way that is, as you have done with Suhail Dev so beautifully, in a way that the young people can relate to, and not with this false sense of jingoism of, Mera Bharat Mahan and everything about us is great. But these are genuine achievements of ours, which I think if we don't have that sense of pride in our own past, our ancestors, I don't think we deserve to call ourselves Indians. And we need to and we'll continue to live under this colonial version of especially our history that's been passed on to us. And I remember again our dear friend Sanjeev, who had said somewhere that until, I think it was an African proverb, he said, until
the lions have their storytellers.
The storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
The hunter, correct.
That's all we have been doing in our horrible historiography.
Very true. A question by Anirudh. Vikram sir, how would you describe the relationship between Savarkar ji and Dr. Ambedkar ji?
Wow.
Good question. Good question.
Very good question.
Vikram, how much time do you have? Look, we can keep going, but I know
I have all the time.
So
I have all the time.
Last two questions. Yeah.
Sure.
Do this and one more if that's okay with you.
Sure. I have all the time. Up to you.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful question, Anirudh, and thank you for that. And so both of them come from the same milieu in Maharashtra, and one is this upper caste Brahmin who's also fighting for social reforms, and so is Ambedkar. And in fact, in the second volume, I'm kind of doing a comparative study of what were the views on caste of Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Savarkar. And it's a magnificent, plethora of diverse opinions. But I find that Ambedkar and Savarkar's views converge so much more in the way I spoke earlier. They were both nihilists who, kind of spoke for a dismantlement of the edifice. Whereas I think Gandhi was, while I would say a pacifist, a reformer, he was also probably a realist. So, little by little, let's not break the whole thing down. Keep the traditions,
but reform it a bit.
Reform it and then bring in as much as possible. So Ambedkar and Gandhi had these fights largely on that issue, where he said you have to take it out totally. But Gandhi knew that Indian society was not always open to that kind of earth-shattering kind of reforms. So Ambedkar and Savarkar never met in those 13 years that he was. Savarkar was actually put in house arrest in Ratnagiri from 1924 to 37, and that's where he makes Ratnagiri the laboratory of his Hindutva,
Reforms.
from theory to this thing where, intercaste marriage, intercaste dining, sitting together and eating, where among Brahmins in Maharashtra, the Deshasthas and the Konkanas and the Chitpavans would not sit together and eat. You had people of the Mahars and the Bhangis and all of them sitting together and eating in a intercaste cafe. You had the first temple that was opened by him called the Patit Pavan Mandir, where there was a Bhangi or a scavenger priest, and the Brahmin would go and bow down to him. So Ambedkar actually writes very glowing letters. He invited him to come and inaugurate this temple and all that, but for some reason, Ambedkar probably did not want to be associated with a revolutionary or whatever, someone with a dubious past. He always sent a lot of letters of appreciation to him, saying, you're doing amazing work, and you're the only one who understands the way to kind of eradicate the evil of the caste system. So, and that is through eradicating the Varnashram, which is the source of this whole Jati Pratha, because unless those 4 groups are dismantled, each of the 4 will give rise to several thousands of subcastes and so on, which was going to create this tussle. So I think to that extent, he was very appreciative, and so was Savarkar. He supported the Mahad Satyagraha that Ambedkar launched, and in all his editorials that he wrote for Shraddhanand, he would always write in favor of Ambedkar. So much so that much later, when Ambedkar was the law minister, became the law minister of India, it is said that when Savarkar was implicated in the Gandhi murder case, his lawyer, Bhopatkar, who was actually called by Ambedkar and said, your client is being falsely implicated in this case by the current government, and you better tell him to take care. And he said a couple of things which Bhopatkar actually noted down in his memoirs, which actually I'm trying to reference and read right now. So though I think he was a little worried to be associated, because as I said, this man was a persona non grata whom no one wanted to be associated with, but I think his sympathies for this man were there somewhere, and the feelings were mutual on both sides.
Interesting. Last question, Vikram.
Yes.
Promise.
Pappu pass ho gaya.
Sorry?
Pappu pass ho gaya then.
Array, with full marks. 99.6%. 0.4% was essay.
Oh God. For bad handwriting?
No, for delaying the second book.
Okay. Fair enough.
Okay, so Anukul Goswami has a question. I'm asking this, but but when and how will the political dispensation direct the appropriate scholars to work towards correcting the grossly distorted history and introduce this in schools, colleges, pre-Bronze Age to the current date? It's a difficult question, I admit that. I mean, but it is easier to find Sanskrit departments in Western universities than in Indian universities. Our great mathematicians, even in our schools, are taught in Western universities, and with the biases that come in the West and not in Indian universities. Even the number of seasons that are taught in Indian schools is actually the European seasons, not the Indian seasons. They teach us India has 4 seasons, when in fact India actually has 6 seasons. It's a very important question, admittedly a difficult question. Up to you how you want to take it. Or if you want to, in Mohinder Ramannath style, just well left, keep the back to the side.
No. Considering you've given me 99.6, I don't think I should. No, I think you're right. It's a very important question, but I think addressed to the wrong people here, both of us, because I think that's been. You asked me to be politically correct, but towards the end, I can afford to be slightly incorrect. Slightly incorrect on a government platform. And I think this has been a failure, let's say, of all governments post-independence, that going back to what Sanjeev's comment on the lion finding its storyteller, after independence, we should have had, till then you had the Orientalists, you had all kinds of the colonial historians who had their agendas in presenting our history to us, almost always telling us that you people are a race who's destined to be subjugated, right? From the mythical Aryan invasion till the British rule, you have always, that's your destiny. And we anyway believed in karma so much. So we would take it up very, blindly. So, but then after independence, it was, I think, a national duty to kind of revise this. And every country revises history, because history is not a cast in stone. It's a very malleable discipline. And depending on new records, new findings. So I always say my book can today be whatever bestseller, very good, well-researched book. But tomorrow, if anybody finds anything which is better than this, my book can just go to the dustbin and it can have no relevance. And that is the beauty of this discipline, which allows itself for multiple viewpoints to coexist and for multiple versions of it to come. And that has been the travesty in India, especially, I think, from the 1970s with the setting up of the ICHR, the Indian Council of Historical Research, where only one political ideology, the Marxist ideology, let's call it out, was allowed to rule roost. And anybody who had an alternative perspective was, their careers were lost. And as you know, scholars depend on postings, on fellowships, scholarships. These were denied to people, including eminent historians like, say, a Jadunath Sarkar or an R.C. Majumdar. So when R.C. Majumdar wanted to write the history of the freedom struggle, the government, and he said, I'm going to do an objective analysis. I'm going to, bring out whatever faults Gandhi had, and he had many when it came to his flip-flops in the freedom movement. So he was actually taken away from the board, and some person who was actually an IAFS officer was put in charge of doing this whole government version of the history of Indian freedom struggle. So very, very sanitized, very diplomatic kind of a version of Indian history. Sorry, Amish, was brought out. And so the perils that were there. And from my state, you had this wonderful literature, S.L. Bhairappa ji, who has written.
I'm a big fan of this.
Yes, and his Avarana, in that he writes, when he was a part of the NCERT, he was always told that those episodes from our past, especially about the invasions and the desecration of temples, or the treatment, the Hindu carnage, as I would call it, genocide over several, or the Holocaust, that should be whitewashed, because that will hamper today's national unity and national integration among communities, which I think is a very, very perverse way of building national unity on false foundations of, whitewashing things. And world over, I think history gives that space for communities to come to experience the fissures of the past and heal those wounds and move on. Now, what's happened from Ghaznavi to Aurangzeb and Tipu Sultan can't be undone, but we need to just relive those so that those mistakes don't happen again. But at the same time, the albatross of that doesn't hang on the shoulder of a young Muslim boy or girl today. So let them also, not have heroes in all these terrible invaders and barbaric rulers. And there are several, others whom they can revere. In my own state, Tipu Sultan is worshipped, whereas Shishunala Sharif, who is a saint, can be the role model, or Abdul Kalam can be, if you really want to have community-specific role models. So I think this...
Many of these invaders were foreigners. I mean, we have to understand that. I mean, they were foreigners.
True.
They weren't Indians. No, absolutely.
So we've been breaking our head and trying to impress upon the government of the day as well for the last 6 years that it's high time our history has a relook, and not based on quackery and all kinds of loonies who will sit and in Rajasthan there's this running joke that depending on whether the BJP is in power or the Congress is in power, now we don't know who's in power, with Sachin Pilot doing all that. Rana Pratap will either be winning or losing the Haldi Ghati battle. So, one makes him the winner, the other changes the narrative. So I think that sort of crazy history rewriting need not be done. So saffronization and detoxification, all these words that I use, but a genuine set of scholars who can be constituted. It's not difficult to find 20 scholars in India who have a very objective perspective to Indian history from different parts of India. Again, the Northeast and large parts of South India where I am, these don't even come into our history narrative. Vijayanagar Empire or the Cholas or the Ahoms, and
Very
all
true.
these, and we're so Delhi centric in our approach. So all these multiple issues that need to be on a war footing. I think the government needs to wake up and do this. But let me end by saying that I think it's sometimes unfair to probably keep expecting everything on the government. So some of us are doing it like what you have done with, your book on Suhail Dev, me with Savarkar, so many others, Hindol with his book on Sardar Patel, so many others, and Sanjeev, of course, and so many. Through books, of course, we're trying to shift that narrative in a non-partisan kind of manner. But also a lot of people are now waking up to say that if the government is not doing much on changing textbooks, let's print textbooks privately through private whatever participation, and then go school by school to CBSE or through all the Kendriya Vidyalaya network and say, look at these textbooks as an alternative to what you already have, which is actually, I mean, I've downloaded all the NCRT history books from class 6 to 12 and going through them. It's miserable. It's almost like you are teaching a young girl and boy in India today to look at his or her country as an outsider. It's almost that these Indians did this. I mean, it's not your ancestor's story being told to you. You're almost like some bystander who's looking and mocking and talking with a very totally disconnected way. I understand you don't have to become passionate, but you can't be so removed from your own past. So I think
the entire education system, the aim is to somehow हमको किसी तरह अंग्रेज बना दो. Just make us British.
Macaulay's this thing of producing mass clerks.
I find modern British have actually more compassion towards India and towards ancient India than our own anglicized elite. It's a little unfortunate.
Wow.
But okay, that is an interesting, very interesting note. Hopeful and at sometimes sad note to end on, but I would choose hopeful. I'm going to end with a comment from Shibani that before you go off, Vikram, thanks a million for telling us so many facts that many of us did not know. And thanks a million to Amish as well for organizing this talk. Thank you so much, Shibani, from my side. Vikram, and if you want to say anything to Shibani.
Thank you, Shivani. It's so nice to hear such views, and it's thanks to technology. I think we're connecting Amish through, despite all this lockdown, etc. We've connected probably to more people through this medium than doing a live event maybe at Nehru Centre there. And so, thank you so much.
Guys, for those who don't know, this program is there on Facebook as well, on our Nehru Centre page. You can share that page with your friends, and you can see the video later as well. Including the unfortunate time when someone shared the screen and hijacked the video.
Scotland Yard. That was a Scotland Yard.
And those of you who want to attend Nehru Centre programs in the future, please visit our website, nehrucentre.org.uk. Share that with your friends as well. You can register for a newsletter right at the bottom. There is a box out there. It's very easy to do. It'll take you precisely 30 seconds. Even a tech cretin like me could do it in 30 seconds. And then you'll be updated with all the wonderful programs that we'll do in the future. And Vikram, if you have any last words.
I'd like to, so Amish, I'm really a very, very heartfelt thanks. I think it means so much to me. First of all, a dear friend like you, and somebody, whose heart and head is in the right place. To engage in conversation on a subject which I think both of us kind of like to talk about, and it's very, very heartening and nice to know that despite all this gloom and pessimism that we have about governments, that the government has chosen someone like you to spearhead the cultural renaissance for India in London, and the amount of good work that you've been doing there, I think it's amazing. And thank you so much for that. And thank you to your entire team whom I think Penguin folks have been badgering for so long, and they've been very patient. And thanks to Penguin, to Premanko, to Preeti, to Sanjita, and everyone who got this act together, saying it's 1 year of the book and we should do something big with someone big. I said no one bigger than Amish, and so that's how this whole thing worked out. Thank you, Amish,
so
for your
much,
time.
Penguin, and of course my wonderful Nehru Centre team. We should end this, Vikram, with you showing the cover of the book. Show that.
Yes.
And we'll end with that. That'll be the video that'll be put up.
one small comment is
Incredible.
this picture to Amish was taken in London, and guess where it was taken? Because it's a very unusual picture of Savarkar in English clothes. So when he comes back by train from Paris, he'd run away to Paris to be with Shyamji Krishnavarma, and then gets fed up and comes back. And the minute he alights at the Victoria station in London, the police come and arrest him, and he's taken to the police station, and where the usual way where all the convicts are photographed, left profile, right profile, and most people are giving these blank looks. Look at this man, the way he's sitting.
This was a police. Oh wow!
And the look in his eyes are like nonchalant and like I care the F about anybody. Yeah.
Full defiance.
So I thought, and this picture was from the criminal file record, which was sourced from the National Archives of UK. So I thought this picture is what should be there, rather than that usual, black topi and that very sullen kind of look that he has.
What a wonderful story to end on. And thank you so much, Vikram. Thank you so much
Thank you, Amish.
Raising the honor of the Nehru Centre by coming here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye, my friend.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Amish. Thank you, Vikram.